This assessment theory video will focus on learning theories. And before I start, I want to make a point of saying that the theories that I've included here are not all the theories that exist. I had to decide which ones would be important for us to consider. It was quite a difficult task as they do all have something to bring and something to teach us, but I chose the ones that I thought would be quite relevant for us, for our purpose in terms of learning and education. And I've also done them or focused on them very briefly or given you an overview. In subjects and modules and clusters that follow, you will be focusing on some of the learning theories in more detail, and at that time you can go a lot more in depth than I have in this video. For example, in educational psychology, you'll focus on some of the learning theories in a lot more depth, perhaps not all of them, and then you can then of course research them, research the different techniques, the different materials, and what it looks like in the classroom in a very real way. So what is a theory? Let's start with what a theory is. So a theory really is an explanation for why something occurs and how it occurs. So it's really around the why and the how. Learning theories describe how students, for example, receive information, how they process the information or make sense of the information that they receive, what influences the way that they retain and internalize knowledge. There's quite a bit that takes or has importance in learning theories, and that is things like the cognitive, emotional, and environmental influences, for example, things such as prior experience. All of this plays a part in understanding your worldview, understanding how knowledge is acquired, understanding how learners are taught from a specific worldview. You'll understand this a little bit more as we go on, but I want you just to get a bit of an idea of a learning theory. So, learning theory, as I say, it's the way students obtain information. If you think of it, it's like the frame around which you would put learning. So a specific type of learning would fall under one frame or one learning theory, and this includes the approach with which the teacher uses to impart the knowledge to the students or to help the students find the knowledge for themselves, the way they are assessed, the way that teachers receive and give feedback. All of this is guided and led by the learning theory that is chosen. So why are learning theories important? You can refer to the Duke, Harper and Johnson article that I have uploaded to this unit. It also gives you some good information around the importance of learning theories, but I've chosen to extract a few parts of not only that article but other articles as well to summarize why learning theories are important. It's not everything, but it's some of why learning theories are important. So I'll start off here at the bottom. So it helps educators and planners find direction. So understanding what the learning theory or the direction is of your lesson allows you to understand what needs to be done, where to start, how to plan, where to end, and understand and helps you to understand what your goals and objectives should be for a lesson and for specific student cohort. So for example, if you know you're working with high school learners and you understand what the endpoint is, your learning theory will also guide you in how to get there to that endpoint. It also improves your ability to prepare learning materials. So different learning theories do suggest or focus on different types of learning materials. So for example, would it be a test? Would it be exploration, reflections, group activities, facilitated activities and so on. The learning theory does also give you a very good idea of how to pursue assessment, how to pursue learning materials, and how to construct in a way that fits in with not only your goals and objectives but also with your learning theory. Beyond that, learning theories also organize what we know about human learning. It gives us an idea of this is how learning takes place, and it helps you then to hit those marks. So for example, if one of the theories like behaviorism says that you need to have a stimulus and response, teachers will know, and you'll understand it a little bit more when we go into behaviorism, teachers will understand that if you provide a stimulus or the learning as a stimulus, the students will respond by interacting with the stimulus and then learning will take place. It's a small example, but as I say, you'll understand it as we go along. And then lastly, also knowledge is created and how people learn through learning theories. We understand what needs to take place for knowledge to be created. We understand that this is how people learn. Again, this will make a lot more sense as we proceed to the next slides and those that follow. So we do have what we call traditional learning theories, and they are behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. Behaviorism, I'm not going to go into too much detail here as well. The slides that focus on each of them individually will be where we really discuss them. But behaviorism is focused on repetition. So repeating, if you think about old school mathematics, repeating, and repeating, that is how learning is really taking place. So you repeat it until it becomes automatic, and it's something that you just know by heart. Cognitivism is an internal process. It focuses on the internal mental processes. We'll talk about that later. And then constructivism is learner-led, and the learner is in charge of constructing, as the name suggests, constructing their own learning. And so it's very much student-led. So it's important that we know that traditional school um, learning theories or traditional ways of looking at learning is usually falls under the ambit of one of these. Teachers usually would have learned from someone that focuses on one of these or uses one of these learning theories, and therefore it became synonymous with traditional schooling. So how many learning theories are there? As I said at the beginning of the video, there are numerous learning theories. It's quite difficult to narrow down the ones that you want to include in a video like this. But the ones that I've chosen to include, I've done so for a reason. So I've chosen the traditional learning theories, behaviorism, constructivism, cognitivism, and then connectivism is quite prevalent and prominent in our learning spaces today. Then andragogy, which took me some time to figure out how to pronounce. I actually had to ask Google how to pronounce it because it's quite new, but I thought it was quite relevant, especially for you as students at TOGI. Then the humanistic learning theory or humanistic approach, and then the 21st century learning theory or learning skills. The 21st century learning theory is more about the skills, but I find them quite important considering who we are teaching today, the learners that we are working with. It's quite important for us to understand 21st century learning skills. The first learning theory we'll be looking at is behaviorism, which has its origins in psychology in the late 19th and early 20th century. Behaviorism for me is what I spoke about earlier. It's quite a traditional learning theory. When I imagine schooling when I was younger, I feel that was a very behaviorist way of approaching learning. Its focus is on external stimulus. So it's a lot around repetition, so repeating something until it becomes automatic. It's a lot around external stimulus. So for example, the teacher's effect on the child, and that then has an impact on the way the child behaves. It doesn't really focus on what's going on in the mind. It doesn't focus on the thinking and mental processes. It focuses mainly on behavior. So if you think about punishment, for example, punishment is a way that has been used in schooling to alter a child's behavior. If a child, for example, is chatting all the time in class and they, for example, are punished by not being able to go out and break, they will possibly shift their behavior to avoid that negative um, consequence of their behavior. So behaviorism really looks at external influences on a child's behavior. How does it impact, how do things impact the child? So the key features of behaviorism is conditioning. So conditioning is if you actually do something to a child so often that they understand that is the expected behavior. So for example, if every time you put your hand up in the classroom, the teacher puts their hand up, every child knows she needs to be quiet or he needs to be quiet, you're conditioning that child to consider the hand up in the air as a way of a teacher saying that you need to be quiet. Other key features include the stimulus and response. So you provide a stimulus and the child then responds to that stimulus. So you provide, um, like I said, the hand up would then be the stimulus and the response will be silence in the classroom. Another key feature is observable behavior. What do you see the learner presenting with, or what does the learner see that affects their behavior? Things are quite sequential and they are triggers. So a trigger, for example, again will be the hand up in the air. That's a trigger for the child to understand this is what I need to do. In terms of what we see in the learner would be instinct driven, externally motivated because they would be receiving punishment or reward for their behavior, and the knowledge start point is external. So this learning theory does not consider any knowledge the child already possesses, but rather what the teacher or the facilitator of, well, in this case, it's not a facilitator of learning, it is a teacher, what the teacher wants the child to learn. The proponents or the main theorists within behaviorism are Watson. I didn't include their names, but their names are something that you can look up for yourself. So it's B.F. Skinner, for example, Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike. Those are the main proponents or theorists of behaviorism, and they've all included their ideas and thoughts into really developing behaviorism as a learning theory. The focus is very teacher focused, it's teacher led. The teacher is considered to be the knower and the lead in knowledge production, and the child is really just the receiver and would have to conform to the expectations of the teacher. Again, the educator needs to create the stimulus and the response situation, so they need to plan how learning will take place, what the stimulus will be, and what they want the response to be. They have to lead or manipulate events and plans to ensure that the child behaves or responds in a specific way. So it's a very right or wrong type of behaviorist theory. So this will be very good in terms of if you want a child to learn how to do or to learn facts. There's a right and a wrong. There isn't really a room for explanation. So that would behaviorism would come in handy in that instance or that regard. So here I've included some examples. So Ivan Pavlov, he really considered classical conditioning to be a very important part of learning. And this is a reflex or reflex response to stimulus, or automatic response to a stimulus. So if you see this picture down here, it's not very clear, but this is an example of his work. So that the dog is the unconditional response, or the salivating of the dog is the unconditional response because it sees the food, which is the unconditional stimulus. So basically it just means that nothing has happened to this dog or this food. This is just a normal situation where a dog sees food and he starts to salivate. During conditioning, what happens during conditioning is that the dog is taught to respond to the food in a specific way. So before that happens, we introduce a neutral stimulus, which is this bell. So the dog sees the food, he salivates. The dog hears the bell, he has no response, normal response, but not a response that we can really consider in terms of what happens when he sees the food. So you pair the dog with the food and you just get salivating. You pair the dog with the bell, nothing happens. But during conditioning, you pair the bell with the food. So every time the dog hears the bell, he also gets food. So he's starting to connect the bell with the food. So you're conditioning him. Once he's conditioned, when he hears the bell, he will salivate. So you've taught the dog to put together the sound of the bell and food in order for him to salivate. So he doesn't even have to see the food, but he hears the bell and automatically the food comes into mind. Not even him considering food, but just the fact that he salivates automatically. So we see this at school a lot. Teachers use a lot of little tricks to get students to be quiet, little tricks to have students behave in a way that you want them to behave. So they condition children in a way to react to a stimulus in a specific way. So hand up, again, same example, hand up, everyone is quiet. That is the way students are being conditioned to react to a stimulus. So this is what we call classical conditioning. Next, John Watson, and he's considered to be the father of behaviorism. And he focuses directly on observable behavior. So I included this little picture over here, which for me is quite a sad picture if I think of the ethics of the experiment at the time. It's called the Little Albert experiment, and I would urge you to read up on it. It's very interesting, but it also shows us how few ethical parameters were in place in years far gone when theorists were developing their theories. So this Little Albert experiment, as you can see here, this little boy, his name is not really Albert, but that's the name that they gave him for the sake of this experiment. Albert sees the rat. Albert's not scared of the rat. He's curious. He looks at the rat. He doesn't have any fear regarding the rat in any way. But they then included a loud sound, or they paired the loud sound with the rat. So the loud sound not only scares little Albert here, but the poor little rat is running away as well. So Albert associates that sound with the rat. And therefore, when he sees the rat, he thinks of the sound that made him scared, and he now associates that feeling of fear with the rat. So as you can see here, the next time he sees the rat, he gets quite fearful, and he's scared, but he doesn't even know why he's scared. He doesn't actually realize that it was actually the bell that made him scared. So that is the way that they've actually created a scenario where he no longer feels the same way about the rat that he did in the first place. And over here, this is quite interesting that the bear is not the same thing as the rat, but because it has similar characteristics, for example, it's furry, it's an animal, whatever the case is, Albert displays the same symptoms of fear as he did when he saw the rat. I'm saying rat, I don't know if it's a rat or a mouse, but Albert is still reacting in the same way. So this is how experiments took place in the past for them to establish these theories. But it's also another way for us to understand what behaviorism is really focusing on, what the focus of behaviorism is. And then lastly, Skinner, he looked at what operant conditioning meant for the learning process. So he really created operant conditioning. And this looks at positive and negative reinforcement. So I'm going to use this we have another rat over here. This is a rat. So he did this experiment with a rat. Operant conditioning considers learning in terms of rewards and punishments, and that's how it looks at affecting behavior, employing either rewards or punishment. So association is made between the behavior and the consequence. So the consequence can be either positive or negative. So here, for example, this is the lab rat. So the initial experiment had a lever, a dispenser where food would come out, so that the pallet of food would come out there, lights, and a speaker. So when the lab rat presses the lever and the light is green, they receive food, and that's the reward. But when they press the lever and the light is red, they receive a mild shock. So because of this, the rat would obviously avoid pressing the lever when the light is red, and that is how they conditioned, or they got the rat to only press the lever when the light was green. So the association came with the color of the lights, and then he would then know, okay, this is a good time to press the lever, because if I press it when it's red, I'll get a shock, but if I press it when it's green, I'll get a pallet of food. So operant conditioning really works on the premise that if you present with the action and you get a positive or a reinforcement, positive or negative, if there's an action followed by a reinforcement, then the outcome will definitely be more likely to occur. So for example, if you are telling a joke, some of the examples that I think are quite good to illustrate this point. So if you tell a joke in the class and everyone laughs, then you're more likely to tell that story again, or you're more likely to present your stories in class because everyone laughs and you feel good about yourself. Also, again, if you do things like dust the board or sweep the classroom and your teacher praises you, you'll be more likely to do the same thing again. But also, conversely, if you do something that is undesirable and there's a punishment, then you most likely would not do that or not present to that behavior again. So it helps you to avoid that behavior, or you are taught actually to avoid that behavior. So for example, if you put a pin on the chair and a learner gets hurt and it becomes like a really terrible situation, and you get punishment and you are kind of ostracized from your classmates for a little while, you are less likely to do that in future. So it's very cause and effect in terms of trying to alter behavior, trying to control behavior. So the how to, you make use of rewards and informative feedback, create goals and outcomes that you expect the child to master, and this will help the child to understand what the skills and behaviors are that are required to meet their goals. The techniques used are usually lectures, memorization and repetition, and then punishment or consequences for not complying with expectations. Materials you'd see checklist, test-based learning, so it's very true or false, multiple choice, and then task-based. So it's really about getting it right or wrong. There's no really in between. And then theorists or proponents within this theory, they consider learning to be for children. They see the children as a blank slate when they come in. There's no existing knowledge that is included in the process. The child comes in as a blank slate, and everything they learn is then taught to them by the teacher.